So we had a great start online yesterday. It was jam-packed with many interesting sessions, and I'm thrilled to introduce our keynote today, Dr. Susan McCann, to kick off our in-person day. Dr. McCann is the Associate Vice President and Vice Provost of Digital Strategies and Vice Provost Innovations in Undergraduate Education at the University of Toronto. In these roles, she provides strategic direction on digital systems, data, and pedagogical innovation, and with a particular focus on how universities can thoughtfully reimagine academic experiences in a rapidly changing landscape, something we can all identify with. Dr. McCann is also a professor in mechanical and industrial engineering and a nationally recognized leader in engineering education. She is the recipient of several major teaching awards, including the National 3M Teaching Fellowship, and a fellow of the American Association of the Advancement of Science in recognition for her contributions to engineering education. Her keynote today, Navigating a Jagged Future, Teaching in the Age of AI, speaks directly to the questions many of us are grappling with. How generative AI is reshaping assessment, curriculum, and learning, and how we can respond in ways that preserve deep learning and meaningful educational experiences. We are grateful and a bit amazed that she can be here today with so many responsibilities to share her insights and help frame our conversations today. Susan, welcome to our conference, and please take it away.
Okay, can everybody hear me all right? Sound check? Great. Thank you so much for inviting me today. I really appreciate the opportunity to be here at the University of Waterloo and talk to you about this very important subject. When I was picking a title for this talk, I very specifically used the term jagged. This is a term that was first coined by Andrei Karpathy, who is a Canadian educated computer scientist. And he meant this in terms of AI's capacity to progress, or the progression of AI's capabilities unevenly. Some areas of AI accelerating faster than others, some lagging behind. And all of that is quite true. But when I picked the word jagged, I really meant it to invoke a sense of sharpness. We're going to talk a little bit at the very end of this about our AI kitchen that we're standing up at the University of Toronto. And when we talk about that kitchen, we talk about things like sharp knives and giving sharp knives to people in our community to work with and what knife safety looks like. So it is a technology that has extraordinary promise. It also has extraordinary capability to do harm. And as we're approaching this, we want to be thinking really thoughtfully about the pedagogies that are being impacted by this technology. And I wanted to start by acknowledging the fact that some of the fundamental pedagogies that we have relied on are being washed away or being impacted in really significant ways. When we teach people to code, to design, to write, it isn't so that they can well, we want them to be able to code, design, and write, but those are pedagogies for learning. We teach critical thinking through these pedagogies, and these are the ones that are being so fundamentally impacted. And that's really difficult, I think, for a lot of our faculty to imagine what comes next. So this came out quite recently. It's the HAI Index on AI. It's one of the more reliable reports. It's about 400 pages thick. It comes out annually from Stanford University. And it's got chapters on environmental impact. It's got chapters on bias. It's got chapters on the technology. Interestingly, I looked first at the public opinion chapter. We rank #1 in the world for being least excited about AI. We're number one, okay? And most nervous. We're also most nervous, okay, as Canadians. So I'm thinking, okay, I'm going to give a keynote address on the technology that people are least excited and most nervous about. Yay. And thinking about, where do we start with this? I like to think that as Canadians, we do have a certain look before we leap kind of mentality on things. And maybe that's not a bad mentality to have with this particular technology. So I thought I might start with a little bit of history of other technologies and one specific one, where Canadians had a little bit more foresight maybe than the rest of the world. This is the city of Boston. I grew up just outside the city of Boston. And there are two pictures here. One is from 1939, one is from 1969. And we saw during that time period across North America a real exuberance about automotive technology. Woo-wee. Automobiles were going to make us faster. They were going to make us more productive. They were going to move things around the world at an accelerated speed, right? All of this was great. And so cities like Boston undertook major build projects of highways that ran straight through the city. And this is Route 93. It's one example. You go to Seattle, you go to Atlanta, Georgia, you go to many, many North American cities. You see this same kind of thing with major highways that were running in and out of cities in order to carry people efficiently in and out of those urban environments. And very often when those highways were being imagined or built, they weren't really necessarily taking into account things like neighborhoods. And so one of the neighborhoods in this particular instance that got somewhat cut off from the rest of the city was the North End. The North End of Boston at the time, in the late 30s, early 40s, last century, was home to many Italian immigrants. The Italian immigration to that city was quite substantial in the early part of the last century. And this was at a time in Boston, back 50, 60, 70 years ago now, when you would see signs up around Boston that would say, "No Italian or Irish need apply." That was not unusual in the city. There was a fair amount of xenophobia about immigration. Sound familiar? And so when the highway was built, and a historian can correct me on this, but there was some thought that we don't really need to include the North End in this beltway through Boston. We can leave it over there. It's an elevated road, 93. People can move under it. It's like the Gardner in Toronto. But nonetheless, it had the effect of cutting off that particular neighborhood to some degree from the rest of the city. And you can see also cut off the waterfront. Again, this happened in Toronto. It happened in a lot of places that had waterfronts. And right to the left, lower left of where that red circle is, you see a metro station, T station marked Haymarket. Haymarket was a slightly grubby, but very lively market. Had lots of little produce shops, lots of Italian delis, lots of little cafes. It was a sort of center and hub for that community in terms of food supply. There were fishmongers and so forth operating there. Haymarket only exists now as a metro station. It does not exist as a market anymore. They have some signs up around the area to mark historically that it was there, right? And so this is what Boston looked like, right? It looked like, if you looked at it from an aerial view, there's Route 93 running right through the city. This is what it looks like now. So after recognizing perhaps that this exuberance around automotive technology went a little too far in terms of the impact on communities, there was a construction project that took place in the early 2000s to bury Route 93, called the Big Dig, cost billions and billions of dollars to try to reclaim the city as a walkable, livable community, to try and attract people back into living in the city, to try and reconnect the North End that was now viewed as a really cultural gem to the rest of the city. Haymarket still doesn't exist. It's still a tea stop. But the idea here was that in our effort to try and reduce the friction of moving people around and in and out of this city, we had lost perhaps something really valuable in the process of being a little over exuberant. So here's Toronto, right? We have the Gardiner, runs down right across the lakeshore. It's elevated, you can move under it, but again, there's endless plans to do something about the Gardiner to try and reclaim the docklands, to try and reconnect the waterfront to the city. But I want to draw your attention to this little stub of a highway here, the Allen Expressway. The Allen Expressway, you may or may not know, comes from the 401 down to Eglinton, and it was supposed to run all the way down through Kensington Market in Toronto and connect to the Gardiner. It was going to bisect the city, right? Would have been super useful yesterday when I was trying to drive here, right? Took me a long time to drive here, a lot of friction. If I could driven 2 blocks from the campus and hopped on to the Allen Expressway, boy, would that have been easy. But then we wouldn't have had, the Blackbird Bakery in Kensington, and we wouldn't have the Social in Kensington, and we wouldn't have had all the fantastic neighborhood that is around that. And that is thanks in part to people like Jane Jacobs, who made a concerted effort along with a lot of community activism in Toronto to stop that highway from being built. Do we need highways? Do we now revolve around cars? I don't think anybody would want to go back to a time when you had to wait several hours to get to emergency room, right? It's useful to have an ambulance that's going to come and get you really quickly, or a fire truck that's going to get to your house quickly. But thinking about a balanced approach, and of course, this is still a very live conversation. If you think about the conversations we're having right now about bike lanes in the city and the way in which bike lanes impede traffic, right? So we have worse traffic for having bike lanes. That friction perhaps keeps people from just sort of hopping in their car and going every day, but it's also, a real nuisance in the city. This concept of these historic patterns around our exuberance around technologies, freedom of movement, economic growth, speed, this comes around from time to time, and certainly AI is reigniting this conversation about what does it mean to remove friction from doing things. But they also have unintended consequences, community disruption, environmental impact. In the case of automotive technology, urban exodus, which had a really substantial impact on cities. And now we're trying to dial everything back. We're building more bike lanes. We're trying to find more green spaces. We're spending a lot of money to try to reclaim things that perhaps got compromised in our exuberance. This is not the only technology where this has happened. We can point to technologies over and over again where we get, as humans, we get a little excited, about things. We get excited about fast food. We get excited about social media. And then sort of later on figure out, wait a second, while this has some really positive possibilities, it's also like literally sort of slicing and dicing us in ways that aren't always very healthy and have an outsized impact on young people or marginalized communities or spaces in our society. And so I'm going to focus today, as we're talking about AI, on two, you can talk about, there are so many things you could talk about AI. We could talk about the environmental impact. We could talk about jobs. We could talk about all of those things. I'm going to focus on the concept of friction and the concept of communities, and that communities matter. It's helpful as we're talking about this technology to think about, to understand a little bit about what it is. Outside of large language models, there is a lot more to this technology, and it's been around for quite a long time. We now swim in AI. We don't swim so much in generative AI, but we swim in AI. Our supply chains, our water supply, our electricity grid, all have AI involved in them. For a long time now, probably every expense that you submit at the university is audited using AI. That's now standard practice. Things like protein design or medical scan analysis are revolutionizing the ways in which science is operating and the way in which our healthcare system is operating and so forth. There are real impacts in our world, and many of these are quite positive. There's also things that are getting deeply disrupted, like music generation. Interestingly, it's not necessarily the songwriters or the performers who are seeing the biggest impacts. It's people like studio musicians who used to create demo tapes that are getting really impacted by this. So outside of the institution and outside of large language models, it's worth recognizing that this is a technology that has a multitude of capabilities. And we can think of it as, in fact, a whole class of technologies in the way in which we think about electricity. As there's a big difference between a hair dryer and a dishwasher, but they're both electrical appliances. They're enabled by electricity, right? We can think of AI as being this kind of class of technologies, and then generative AI as being just one subclass of this plethora of different capabilities. I promised Dave Davidi, my very dear old friend, and sorry he's finishing his term, that I would tell people that LLMs do not store the internet or mash up ideas from the internet, because I think there are still some misunderstandings, some real misconceptions about the way this technology works. We could talk more about how it works and how it does what it does, but I think it's very important to recognize that there are some fundamental sort of misthinkings about this. I go back to some of the threshold concepts that we work with our students on. For the longest time, I imagined electricity as, a fluid flow. That's a really common mental model that students hold about electricity. And then you get op amps, and you totally get flummoxed by op amps when you hit that. But if you have some of these misunderstandings about the way generative AI works, it can impede, I think, the understanding or the thinking about the technology in a way that helps you kind of confront it. And I'm generally an optimist, especially in my teaching. I used to say that I'm an unmitigated optimist with a pragmatic side. But I think when it comes to things like AI, I am perhaps a bit of a realistic pessimist with an optimistic side. And I think as a realistic pessimist, it behooves us to think really carefully about what the technology is, what its limitations are, what it does and how it does it in order to confront this both challenge and opportunity. And that's where the wicked piece comes in. It's wicked in that it has these perhaps incredible opportunities. You know, I go back to the automotive example, but it's also got some real risks. So let's talk about friction. This is a nifty little paper that I printed it out and then I just kept sharing it with people. So I kept having to print it out because I kept handing it to everybody who came into my office. It's called Against Frictionless AI. And it's only about 3 or 4 pages long. It's quite short. It's from a group of cognitive psychologists. They happen to be at U of T. But it talks about friction not only in terms of learning, but also in terms of making friendships. A little bit of loneliness actually motivates us to keep and make friends, for example. Too much loneliness is a bad thing. Same thing in learning. A little bit of friction goes a long way in struggling in learning. And so they have this really nice diagram in their paper. I adapted it here. But basically, you know, it has the analogy to a chairlift going up the mountain versus the hiker. This chairlift has been called in literature cognitive collapse or cognitive atrophy. And it really is something that we worry about. You know, I probably would weigh a bit less and run a bit faster if I didn't have a car. Technologies that are assistive can become disabling if we over-rely on them. And how do we help our students sort of confront that reality and make wise choices about when to use it and when not to use it? I borrowed this slide from our learning strategists at the University of Toronto. It may be a little fuzzy, but I hope it's readable. I wanted to reproduce it as I'm giving the presentation, so the slides will be available afterwards if you want them. But this is from a group of 4 learning strategists who are just fantastic. And they, of course, are talking to students every day and asking them about their AI use. And turns out our students are much more frank with our learning strategists than they are with their professors, and will reveal a bit more. But the learning strategists are also really good at asking questions like, not just, are you using AI, but what are you using it for? How do you describe your use? And they started to see this pattern of this range from de-skilling to upskilling in the use of AI, and then went to the literature and found some literature on this. And so I really like this spectrum, that it isn't necessarily the technology in and of itself, it is how they're using the technology, how they're approaching it, that really makes a difference. Let's talk about one particular example. I'm going to use AI tutoring systems. I noted there's some really interesting talks at the conference on AI tutoring systems. We're experimenting with AI tutoring systems. I think a lot of universities are. AI tutoring systems are a really interesting example, I think, of what's emerging in this field around trying to add some friction back into LLMs. You know, LLMs will do, they're so sycophantic, right? They will do anything for you if they're people pleasers. They want to answer your question. That's not great. You know, that's a lot of people compare it to going to the gym and having a personal trainer who's like, oh, is that too hard? I'm so sorry. Let's reduce the weight for you as much as we can, right? that's not a great trainer. You actually want a trainer who's going to push you a little, who's going to tell you a bit to kind of suck it up and work harder, right? We would like AI tutors to be a little bit more like that. At U of T, we happen to be using a system from that was designed by Professor Danny Liu at the University of Sydney called Cogniti. But there's both these kinds of open source things, but there's also lots of homegrown ones. And fundamentally, what they're trying to do is add some Socratic method or friction back into the system. Does it work? There's some fantastic work by Hamza Bastani. So Hamza Bastani is a professor at the University of Pennsylvania who's been, as far as I know, doing more work on testing AI tutors than anybody else that I've come across. And this was some of her work that was recently published in the OECD Education Outlook Report for 2026. And what they found, and this is one example of one tutor. I don't know the details of the design of this tutor, so it might be a pretty good one or not so good one. But basically, they were looking at, whoops, I just turned it off. Okay. They were looking at practice with GPT base, which is a basic LLM, just a normal LLM, versus a GPT tutor. What they found was when students practiced, they had greater practice results with the tutor and less but better than no Gen AI practice results with the base LLM. But when it came to the exam, the students who were using the base LLM actually scored 17% worse on the exam. And the students who were using the Gen AI tutor scored the same as if they had been using no Gen AI. So it was a wash. Wah, wah. It's kind of, I suspect that we will start to see more and more of these studies with different tutors testing under different conditions. If you're familiar with the Hake paper on active learning, that was a meta study of active learning across all kinds of situations in high school, colleges, universities, it compiled hundreds of studies together. I think we're beginning to see the emergence of that kind of literature. And at some point, somebody is going to bring these all together and say, okay, the overall findings are X. But we don't have that yet. What we have is things like Hamza's work. And there's another paper by Hamza, which I couldn't pull up right away on. I'm not sure where it is, but where she and her group tested two different kinds of AI tutors. One would answer students' questions whenever the student wanted to get some help, and the other one would not. It would not answer student questions. It wouldn't even ask them, sort of Socratic questions. It would just sit there until the student appeared to be frustrated, and then it would step in. And it turned out that students who had the non-responsive AI tutor did better than the one that would respond to the student when they felt they needed help. Interesting. This is a different study. It was in the same report, OECD report, looked at active learning, and who knows, again, what kind of active learning, how much of it, in what kind of situation, like all of those things. Active learning versus home learning with a Gen AI tutor. They purport to show that there's a higher learning gain with the Gen AI tutor over basic active learning. Again, I suspect one study, we're going to see a lot more of this coming out. I'm withholding judgment until I see much more data coming out. And when we can start to look at different parameters in the design in the active learning, the design in the tutor. So let's not get like, so, whoa, look, there's a study on this. Like, we're looking for more on this. But it's worth kind of starting to monitor the early data that's coming out on AI tutors and what makes them effective. What kinds of design make them effective? Because we're all experimenting with them. We'd like to know that we're experimenting with things that are using best design principles. I worry, however, about any Gen AI tutor that has students working by themselves in these environments, because there is a whole lot more to learning than just the stuff that we teach, the content that we teach, right? We're losing things like the tutoring effect, which is when one student explains something to the other student. This is a long-standing recognized effect. The student who's doing the explaining also gets something out of that exchange, right? We lose some of the executive skill function that it takes to plan out that I have to go to office hours at 3 o'clock tomorrow afternoon. I can't just ask the question at 2 o'clock in the morning. We lose some of the learning to learn through struggling, depending on the design of the tutoring system. We don't just want them to learn the stuff in our course. The point of struggling through learning is actually to make them a better learner for the next course they take in a different subject. It's that idea of building up the muscle strength around persistence. And communication across difference, right? You can train these AI tutors, and of course, a lot of these companies are saying, you can make the tutor have any personality that fits the student. Isn't that amazing? I'm like, it could, but also, you know, there is a set of learning that comes with when I have to try and pose a question for my instructor in a way that helps them understand it. I am putting my mind into their mind to think about, like, how is the way I'm asking the question, framing it, going to be good for that person, knowing who they are in their context. And when they give me an answer, I have to interpret it, right? I have to interpret across that difference, that human difference. And that's really critically important. So there's, you know, way more to learning than the stuff. And there's a pretty good read by Danny Liu, who is a really fantastic guy in the teaching and learning space. It's called Stuff, Skills, and Soul. You know, he talks about the fact that at universities, we teach stuff, skills, and soul. And we used to do a lot more with stuff. And then when the internet came along, we kind of rebalanced and said, we teach skills. And then this has come along, and maybe it's time for rethinking the balance around the stuff, the skills, and the soul. And the soul being, he has it in much more detail, and it's well worth reading about what we mean by the development of things like professional identity and meaning, and a compass in university and for students. So this is a picture that I've been using for some time around, you know, what kind of future do we want at the university? And I would say more broadly for society. I don't want to spend my day coming in and talking to my AI agents so that they can talk to your AI agents. And that's how I spend my day, right? And my students only interact with their AI agents for designed to some degree by me for learning. That's not great. And it's not healthy. We're healthiest as human beings, I think, when we're not only individually healthy, but when we are in community with each other, when we have built trust relationships, when we have that sort of sense of an, in fact, really effective social network, that concept of a neighborhood or a community. So how do we think about moving toward and centering that community in the upper, or the future that's in the upper right there, rather than the future that is in the lower left? Our students are also very keen on this. They have expressed a real concern about job loss, cognitive collapse, cognitive atrophy. For the most part, our students are here because they really want to learn. They want to get something out of university that's more than what they could get from a library card or looking up on the internet, right? They are looking for learning and they are interested in gauging that. They do feel like this is data from KMPG and from the Digital Education Council. They feel like they lack some sufficient knowledge. They don't feel AI ready. They're looking to universities for helping them navigate this world in a wise way. So AI is a jagged technology. It does have this incredible potential for good, but it also has this incredible potential for harm. And we're trying to navigate it. I hope we navigate this future in a way that doesn't require us to do the big dig afterwards to try to dial back to the community and the world we want, but actually allows us maybe do a little bit more first shot toward that balance in the first place if we think about this technology more thoughtfully and make some wise choices right out of the bat. So we're in a liminal moment. I think right now the technology is kind of racing ahead of some of our teaching practices. It's moving quickly enough that we're kind of playing catch up in some cases. And what our colleagues in computer science are feeling about coding kind of being washed away, introductory coding, or our colleagues in the humanities that feel like writing as learning is being really undermined. We're going to see that in engineering design pretty soon. We're going to see that in a lot of other fields quite quickly. I do a lot of reading in this area. And so some of these are my ideas and some are mashed up in the sort of generative sense from other sources. But I do think that we're going to be looking at a greater emphasis on experience design. We're going to see more assessment through observation. We already see this emerging. Interestingly, I've been using a tool in my course. I haven't taught this year, but previously in my course, we used a tool called Perusal. There's one called Hypothesis. There's a bunch of tools like this. They've been around for a decade. And it's social annotation of text material. So the students are annotating and responding to each other inside a text. That's that social part. But their annotations are being watched and graded by an AI. This goes back a decade. And I get a confusion report. So what I get as an instructor is something that says, hey, your students seem to be particularly confused about this area of the text or that area of the material. So we're seeing the emergence. I think that's the early indicator of something that looks more like a Montessori kind of approach to assessment. That assessment through observation rather than traditional testing, for example. But we're not necessarily the observers, which is interesting. And then I think, prioritizing human interaction during class time, active learning is always really fundamentally important, but I think it becomes ever more important. And something that I think holds true and has held true through my whole career, this actually is a quote, I think, from my tenure submission when I was going up for tenure a very long time ago, is that assignments should be authentic, compelling, and relevant. And relevant to the students, not to us, to the students, right? I think is critically important. And the compelling part is intriguing. Students want to engage with that material, with that learning, with that activity. So We published a report about a year ago at the University of Toronto, and the very first line, it was human written, is that the University of Toronto is an institution dedicated to the development of human potential. And it seems silly, like what would a university be if it wasn't this? You know, robots teaching robots is not a university. Of course, it's dedicated to human potential. But what does that, what does that look like? It may not be the most efficient place in the world, right? It's not the most efficient place in the world. And that's okay. Friction matters. Friction matters. So our task force report has a bunch of recommendations. I'll leave that up for all of 10 seconds. It's probably the same as what you would think it would be. But one of the centerpieces of it is this thing called the AI kitchen. And we very deliberately picked the concept of a kitchen because we think of a kitchen as being a very human place, a place communities and people and families gather for nourishment, a place that is sort of counter to fast food. It may be a place where you slow down and have conversations and you work together on projects and on making things. It's also got some, we can lean into like having a pantry full of institutional protected data, and we can lean into the analogy a bit. You know, street food is the AI that faculty drag in off the street. But we're thinking very carefully about like what should be in the kitchen, what kind of appliances and what kind of training should we have. We're setting up a chef's kit, which is an integrated developer environment that's protected, some other things. So we really like this as a way of thinking about how do we work in community with each other through this, with this technology to enable some interesting outcomes. So I'll leave you with this. Thank you very much. And I'm happy to take questions. The LMS is going to be very different. And what that looks like, totally different, I think, in the very near future. But I'll just leave that up on the screen. And I've got a bigger version of that if you want to look at it. But thank you very much and happy to take questions.
Thank you very much, Dr. McCann. That was riveting. I'm sure we have lots of questions. I've got a bunch, but let's start with the audience. That was incredible fodder for us to think about, and I'm glad to know we're in good company, that we're not the only ones who are anxious about this, and that maybe anxiety, maybe Canadian anxiety about new technology is a good thing. So there are, I believe, mics around. So who wants to start? We're scanning for hands. We've got some in the very back. Hang tight. Mike's coming. Runners running.
No chairlift.
Good.
Lots of friction. Yes, lots of friction. Thank you very much for the talk. So I think everybody in this room agrees about the importance of friction in learning. How do we convince our students that that friction is also very important?
Yeah, I think that actually, you know, at 2 o'clock in the morning when the assignment is due tomorrow, like, or when I'm sitting in traffic in Toronto, I don't appreciate friction. But I am able, you know, I think as humans, I love the quote from Richard Felder, who's a very famous guy in engineering education, who started to talk once by saying, you know, students are a lot like people. And so we can talk rationally about friction when we are not in high friction moments. We can talk about like, how do we make wise choices and actually like write down for ourselves like what our principles are around making decisions about these things and reflect on them before you're in the moment. Because when you're in the moment, you just want to get the thing done. You just want to get to the place. You just need, you know, lunch right this minute. So that sort of planning ahead and thinking about it before it's in the moment. Students do come to university, for the vast majority, I won't say every single one, but the vast majority do come because they want to learn. They don't want to look back in 4 years and say, oh, I took a chairlift every time. And so helping them sort of plan out things and think through it and find their own compass when it comes to AI before they're in the moment. It's a bit like, self-defense classes where you're asked to practice how you respond when you're in a crisis situation or you're confronted by a threat. Acting it out ahead can be really actually helpful. Thinking about what you're going to say to yourself and what you're going to do. And so I think we have a moment to do that conversation with our students, but it's incredibly important that we do. Our students trust us, and they want to know when we're using AI. When I give this talk or something like this, I don't give exactly this talk, but I do one for our introductory design course in engineering. I am very transparent about what part of the slides are AI generated or not AI generated. I put that on all my, if I do a picture like you saw on the friction one. I think that's important as well, that trustworthiness that you carry with your students.
Thanks, Susan.
That's the advice I can give.
That's great. I know there were lots of other hands up there.
Yeah, thank you. You mentioned a couple of initial studies on smart tutors. Would you please share some of your favorite ways to keep your ear to the ground on these sorts of developments?
Sure. The favorite way to keep the ear to the ground. This is really, it's so much literature out there. So I was saying we have sort of a few different tables at the University of Toronto that I work with, small, medium, large. And the largest sort of group that I work with is the AI Roundup. So once a month, I do a lunch and learn. I go online from 12 to 1 and talk about all the latest news that's come up over the last month in AI that I think is relevant for our community. And anybody can tune in. And then at the end, I also talk about like what we have going on around the university. I usually get between 200 and 250 people who show up for that. There's over 1,000 that are registered and can watch the recording on that. But when I'm putting together the roundup, I rely partly on things people send me because through the roundup, they know I'm interested. So people share things with me. But I also am sort of a voracious reader of tech news and other things. So that's everything from some really fantastic writers in the New York Times, like Cad Metz and Kevin Roos, Hard Fork, The Verge, Decoder, podcasts. There's a fantastic article this morning in the New York Times from Jasmine Sun, who had a really great article last month in The Atlantic. She's a professional writer. She talks on a Hard Fork episode about how she uses AI as a professional writer, which is fascinating. I also read The Verge, CNET, Ars Technica. I have a whole list that I go through with some regularity. But if you can find, you don't all need to do that. Like not everybody needs to do that. What you need to do is find one or two people who are a bit obsessed and then get them to tell you, like act as mavens, right? Like I have a maven up here. Mavens are, Malcolm Gladwell talks about mavens. Mavens are really important, right? If you can find yourself some mavens who do this for you and then cull it down to a bite size, it's really helpful, I think.
Thank you.
Oh, sorry. Hi, my name is Zoe. I'm actually a student here at Waterloo. I really appreciate what you have to say on creating, environments where you can talk about when you've used AI as a professor and creating that that sense of trustworthiness between you and your students. That being said, I see a lot. I'm the CAPS coordinator, the Center for Academic Policy here at Waterloo for the undergraduate students. So I work with the students who are caught and or accused of using AI. So those students who you guys, flag, a lot of them will come to me and I will have those discussions with them. And a lot of the time, proactive approaches are really important. But a lot of students feel like they are almost always in a situation where they wouldn't appreciate friction in a crisis scenario, with work culture and mental health crises. And I would say students do trust their professors, but when it comes to AI, they don't have that trust. And they don't feel comfortable having those conversations, even if their professor initiates them. It can be really, really hard for a student to be honest about something like that because it's such a taboo thing and it can have there's just such a massive fear around it for students thinking that they're going to get marked worse and just reinforcing that whole crisis scenario. How would you what kind of system would you use to facilitate a actually safe dialogue for students, especially considering they often feel like they're always in a crisis scenario when they're doing school?
Yeah, so a couple of things. First of all, I think this is where our learning strategists are so critical as kind of independent third parties who are not in that assessment relationship with the student. I think that's so I would strongly encourage students to reach out to learning strategists. I'm sure Waterloo has fantastic learning strategists. These are just gems in any institution. I also think, when I talk about this as a technology that slices and dices communities and has some real harms, I do think that it has and is doing harm to the trust relationship in the classroom. And we are part of that community that is being sliced up. And in some sense, we're, quite honestly, perhaps doing a little bit of the slicing when we sort of are policing our students around academic integrity and use of AI to an inordinate degree, right? Some universities have approached this quite differently. University of Sydney has what they call Lane 1 and Lane 2 assessment. Lane 1 assessment is what takes place in a secure environment. It's exams, midterms, tests, not allowed to use AI in those. Lane 2 is assessment for learning, assessment as learning. It's what happening outside the classroom. They've pretty much said you can use AI in any of that, period. I don't know that would fly at my institution, but that is the choice they made because they were so concerned in part about what this was doing within the classroom around this this friction or fraying of the relationship in the classroom, right? We don't allow the use of detectors. We don't allow partly because they're not reliable. Our legal folks have said no. The kind of evidence that faculty have to collect goes back to, talk to the students, see if they can explain their work kinds of things. I know we want students to do the work because we assign it because, but frankly, when I was a new faculty member, students would copy lab reports from each other. We didn't have Turnitin. How in the world was I going to get them to actually, I actually thought there was value in them doing lab reports. So I changed that assessment quite substantially. That's in 1995 to make it quite different. I think we're just going to have to work through this, but having students feel ashamed about what they're doing is not great. And so how do we work through that while also recognizing that faculty really, really want their students to learn? They don't want to be there to police, right? This is a wicked problem. This is a wicked problem.
If you have questions, I'm going to ask you to raise your hand so that we can map our way through STC, please.
Thank you, Professor, for the insightful talk. I actually initially when introduced him, you're from mechanical and industrial engineering, and how come this professor will talk about AI? But after listening to your talk, it's amazing. You have great knowledge on AI things. And my question is related to the assessment. So I'm a lab instructor in ECE department, electrical and computer engineering in UW. So before AI, I used to notice that we used to have the written reports. Only few people used to get the like 100% marks kind of thing, or around 90 kind of thing. But nowadays, I noticed everybody, most of the majority people, they are getting 90 and up. And they are, I know that they are using the AI to get the answers. And when I observe the same students grade and during their practical, when I was observing their the performance in the lab, they were poor, but they are getting good grades kind of thing. So I was wondering how you guys deal with this kind of assessment challenge. Just I would like to know.
Yeah, I think, every faculty member, this is the challenge. Every faculty member is sort of approaching this, and I'm strongly encouraging as I go around and talk to departments, because I've given talks for departments from art history to civil engineering, chemical engineering to anthropology, like all over the university. Very interesting to see the conversations. I would say in every space that I've spoken in, there is a very, very wide range of feelings. I don't think I have ever worked on a topic in my career where I went in to speak about this and had such a diversity of feelings, from people who are like gung-ho, the university needs to move faster, why are we so behind, we should have frontier models available to everything for everybody, like why are we not just telling students they can use it for everything, to faculty who are livid. They are angry, like visibly shaking angry about this technology and everything in between. Like it's a very wide range of feelings from students as well. Historically, there is some evidence that as technologies come along, my friends in sociology will tell you that when dishwashers and washing machines were invented to make women's lives easier, it actually increased the quality expectations for housework. It didn't actually reduce time. It increased quality expectations. I rather suspect that we're going to get to a point where what was a 90 becomes a 75. Because the expectation is they have access to this technology. We're going to expect that much more. Professor Goel talked about, like, when he showed up, the expectations for what you could do as an undergraduate. Well, now we're having them do stuff that is kind of would have been at graduate level at undergraduate, because the tools are available, because symbolic manipulators came into being, and so on. So I think we're going to see an evolution in our assessments and in our expectations as a result. But we're in a liminal moment, and liminal moments are jagged. Some things have raced faster than others. And institutions, universities, I would say, are slower in a good way sometimes at catching up to things. It means we're not blown around by the latest wind that's blowing this way or that way. We have ballast. We tend to to go on trajectories in a way that has a bit more of kind of a compass to it. I keep using the word compass, but that's important. So we'll get there. But yeah, every faculty member is having this conversation. I hope you have it within your department. I think that's really important as norms of practice emerge in different disciplines.
We have time for maybe one or two more questions, and then we'll continue the individual conversations in small groups.
Hi, my name is David. I work here at the university. I just want to say thank you, first of all, to the comment that was made up there about trust in the classroom. And I noticed there's like some nervousness even in asking this question because of the themes that you've brought up around wisdom and around looking back to the soul of education and what we bring to it. Two things that I think are generally either assumed or overlooked in the university as part of our learning. And I'm curious, where do you see us looking to find the wisdom to look and develop and support the fostering of students, that aspect of the student development?
Yeah. We have an awful lot of really fantastic experts in the university. We don't always look to our own experts, weirdly. Sometimes I hear things that my colleagues talk about in their keynote speeches at conferences, and I think, why didn't they tell us that? You know, it would have been really helpful. And so I think you've got people in sociology and anthropology and human development work and identity work. You know, talk to the experts you have, talk to the experts at other universities. We have a lot of this learning sort of locked up. It gets let out through journal articles and conference presentations, but we don't always draw on that deep, deep well of wisdom and knowledge that we have at our own institutions. And I would say that's across the board. We're not great at doing that. You know, when we're looking for information on things like AI safety, we have AI safety experts. They're like right there. They consult with governments of like countries. Let's talk to them, right? They need a little help translating, you know, the difference between working with a government to working with a university. Sometimes you have to work hard to get their time and attention because that's not where their focus is. Their focus is on, you know, that niche paper for Nature. Fair enough. That's what we incentivize. But if we could find those really fantastic people, either within our own universities or others, that is a really good place to start, I think, for some of this. Yeah.
Thanks, everybody, for the terrific questions. And thanks to Susan McCann for this fantastic and thought-provoking talk that will continue to allow us to talk the rest of the day. Thank you.